Thank you, Anna Eshoo, for joining us today for this conversation. Anna Eshoo is the powerful senior member of the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House and chair of its very, very important health subcommittee. So you play a vital role in the health policy of the nation. So
well,
my first question.
It's wonderful to be with you.
Great.
Thank you.
No, well, we've worked together now for some period of time, very successfully in a number of projects. So wonderful to have this conversation. First, your priorities in the health policy of the nation for the rest of this year. We still have a few months left in this year.
And every day counts.
And every day counts.
Every day counts.
And then the next Congress. So what are your priorities?
My top priority is to get ARPA-H, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, over the finish line. We were successful in getting it through the House, through my subcommittee, through the full committee, and the floor of the House, 336 to 85.
You remember those numbers?
Oh, I do. They always stay with me. So now I'm working hard to make sure that we get it over the finish line, specifically working with the Senate. So that's a high priority because this new agency, it's a new agency that we're creating, and we don't have anything like it at the federal level, is to take on the deadliest diseases. We do fabulous research at NIH. We have other efforts, but we don't have an effort like this. It's modeled after the highly successful Defense Advanced Research Agency that has just produced across the board. So that's number one. Along with that is I have a bill that has advanced in the House, and I want to see that get over the finish line, and that is diversity in clinical trials. If that becomes law, it will be the first time that a standard has been set for clinical trials. So that's a very important one. We know in our country that African Americans, Hispanic, older Americans disproportionately get Alzheimer's, but it's not reflected in the trials. So this is really very, very important. And there's also a caregiver legislation that we got through the committee, and I'd like to see that get over the line because it'll provide services and resources for unpaid caretakers in taking care of those that have Alzheimer's. So these are my top priorities.
Well, that's a good, solid, valuable, high-impact list.
It is. It is. Well, you know, the words in each one of these bills will walk into people's lives, and they will make an enormous difference.
Let me ask you, let's take each of those in turn. ARPA-H, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health.
Yes.
Modeled after the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, as you mentioned. What do you hope we are able to do in a transformative way? I mean, we now have all these health agencies in HHS. How is this different from NIH, FDA, CMS? Because we have an audience here that in fact is, I'm not so dulled by all of the acronyms of Washington, but we have a lot of health agencies.
Of course they are. I'm dulled by them too.
So
well, first of all,
different?
it's small. It's nimble, and it instead of when you think of federal agencies, they think of themselves by not only the dollars they receive for whatever their function is, but also how large they are to grow that agency. This is the opposite. You have project managers that cycle in and cycle out. It's high risk. It's high risk. Where there are failures, they erase that and move on. So it really is almost the opposite of the way federal agencies work. and highly productive when you look at the DARPA model. So we have diseases, George, that are, when someone receives the diagnosis, it's a death sentence. And we know that. This small, nimble, high-risk agency is designed to take those on. And I think if we have a breakthrough in one death sentence disease, I will claim victory. I think we all
And you
will.
should claim credit. I know you don't look for credit.
No, I
but
don't.
you
This is-
look for, it'll be
this
a
is-
legacy that will be long-standing.
Yeah.
The analogy that I love in the DARPA agency is that they don't make a better plane, they make planes invisible.
Exactly.
It is a completely different way of looking at
It
an
is.
issue
It is.
and then bringing it to market. So NIH, as good as it is not responsible for actually taking research to market, to the American people. And so what excites me about what your work has done in ARPA-H is the notion that they can partner with business, they can partner with government, they
Yes.
can partner with anybody to get the problem solved and get it to the American people.
Exactly.
So I think that's really quite exciting.
It is.
How active do you think Congress should be in overseeing that agency in terms of reporting, in terms of understanding what they're doing, and making sure that they meet the mark of a transformative agency?
Well, Congress has a very, one of its most important roles is oversight. But this is a small independent. We have to make sure it remains independent, that it doesn't somehow pick up the lint of, of what, perhaps slows down other agencies and then begin to mimic that. It is in its structure. We need to make sure that it remains independent and that it continues to be funded properly. Now, Congress has already funded ARPA-H, $1 billion, that's with a B, and that was a victory. That's a victory. And that funding, I believe, goes to 2024. So it needs to be funded properly. The legislation has a very important, it speaks to the structure of the agency. So that's why the legislation needs to pass. Now, there has been an appointment of a director. I'm very pleased with, actually, she's a constituent of mine. And so we're moving along, but the legislation really does need to become law. So I want to make sure that I'm doing everything I can to get it to the president's desk. It have its funding, it has, the structure is spelled out in the legislation, and importantly, the dollars for it to stand up. And
It was highly bipartisan, the vote you
yes.
got in the House.
Oh, yes.
There doesn't seem to be any opposition to this in the Senate. So what is the sticking point in getting it done this
Well,
year?
the sticking point right now is that one of the senators wants it to be part of another bill. That bill and what it has in it, the House doesn't agree with. So, we've worked out the low-hanging fruit, but we still need to get past that. I won't give up at all on this. And I think that what the House did was to present legislation highly bipartisan. We are presenting something to them on a silver platter.
We and the cancer community are about to approach ARPA-H and its management with the idea of creating a universal blood test for all chronic diseases of aging, starting at about age 40 and age 50, to predict who is most likely to get those diseases, and then target vaccines or other disease-interrupting drugs early in the course of those diseases to prevent symptomatic presentation or death of cancer or Alzheimer's or other diseases. So this is one of those areas where you need somebody to think across diseases, you need somebody to think about new technologies, and you need thoughts about how you rearrange your regulatory and payer systems to accommodate the possibility of vaccines for these drugs.
Well, what you're describing is bold thinking. And that's what ARPA-H is designed to do. And
and
that's
so-
why I think it's so exciting.
We may call it the Eshoo Initiative. Or after the senator that's holding things
Well,
up.
whatever.
So let's take on clinical trial diversity. Intriguingly, just a couple of weeks ago, ASI Corporation announced a very successful phase 3 trial
Yes.
of a new drug that seems to have a very positive clinical benefit and a reasonably good safety profile. So that particular trial population was 25% minority, and it had not only minorities and women adequately and effectively represented, it had people with heart disease, it had people with diabetes included in the trial population. So what's exciting about this, and there'll be more evidence about this in November, is that it had a population that mirrors the Medicare population.
Yes.
In terms of racial and gender diversity, in terms of comorbidities. And what's interesting about that is that each of those subpopulations can be statistically significant in understanding the different performance of the drug in different subpopulations. So what you're describing is absolutely necessary. So
It is.
I would ask you to think through how it is. I will tell you, because Medicare basically called this issue out in connection with its refusal to cover this class of drugs, industry, we know from our own clinical trial operation, has responded really terrifically. The United States government, because it works out of big academic hospitals that don't typically serve low income and minority populations, has been slower. So I am encouraged by your legislation because I presume it applies both to industry trials as well as to government trials.
It does.
And I think that's
does.
important.
And, when I first came to Congress, women were not included in clinical trials. Now, that sounds rather quaint now, but...
You have nasty hormones, and those mice had nasty hormones that confounded
Yeah, exactly.
research.
So we know what the benefits are when there is diversity, because we're a diverse country. It's a diverse population. And if you don't have that in clinical trials, then you're leaving people out. And it's not fair. But this is also about good science.
You're right. Medicare, when it confronted the first disease-modifying drug in Alzheimer's, decided not to cover the entire first class of disease-modifying drugs. And at the moment, given Medicare's posture, they are not going to cover this drug, this new drug, even if the FDA approves it as safe and effective. I'm curious as to whether that makes sense to you or not.
Well, when I look out across the country and know that there are at least 6 million Americans suffering from Alzheimer's, how can we look any of them and their families straight in the eye and say, sorry, we're not doing this? I don't agree with that. Every day, these families are praying for some kind of breakthrough. So I think that they deserve better. This is the family of the American people. If we're going to set up a new agency, ARPA-H, for breakthroughs, those breakthroughs have to reach people. Otherwise, it really doesn't mean a darn thing to them. So I don't agree with that.
So that takes us to the next question. This is a family disease, and as you pointed out, with some caregiver legislation to provide support for those unpaid caregivers, because every family is affected by this, and every person that has Alzheimer's probably is another half a dozen people who emotionally, financially, or physically, or even in their own health, get affected by this disease. So what do you hope to achieve with your caregiver legislation?
I had great hopes with legislation that was part of Build Back Better, because we had not only universal pre-K education across the country, but we also had child care, and we also had elder care. But it didn't make it in the Senate. We passed all of that in the House. So typical of these efforts, just as we have struggled for decades and decades and decades with universal health care in our country, this is on the to-do list. This is an enormous burden for families, an enormous burden for families. And I've seen it in my own family. I moved my parents into my home, saw to it that they were cared for. They're both in heaven now. I have no regrets, but it was really tough, really tough.
And what does the legislation hope to accomplish?
Well, the legislation is there would be paid services.
To substitute for the family, or would you provide, if the family got informed and certified in some way, would you actually pay the family member?
Well, there has to be help to them, because when someone is diagnosed and there's the disease, talking about Alzheimer's, the disease progresses, you have to be there with them. Someone has to be there. They can't do the very basic things for themselves, bathe, feed themselves, all of that. So they need help. They need help.
I know this from 3 generations of my own family: a grandmother, a mother, and now a sibling.
Yes.
And at each stage, you're absolutely right. At some point, the family takes on an enormous burden, and at some point, it's unbearable, and they have to move into some assisted living context. But,
well, do they go to work and help provide for the rest of their family? But the demand is that someone be there. My mother took care of her mother. She took care of my father's mother. But that was a time when women were at home. I don't know what would have happened in my family if my mother was out having to work, help earn a living, to provide for us. My father did that.
Or they dropped out of the workforce.
Exactly.
And that has obviously created some supply shortages in our society today.
It's a crushing burden.
It is. So finally, let me get into vaccines.
Yes.
There are now 3 vaccines in clinical trials for Alzheimer's. They're pretty exciting because obviously they are easier to administer rather than an infusion product. They're likely to be much, much less expensive than the current class of drugs. We had a pretty good and successful effort in creating a vaccine for COVID through Operation Warp Speed.
Yes.
What would be your view of trying to create a like kind of effort for vaccines for Alzheimer's?
Wouldn't that be something coming out of ARPA-H? Wouldn't that be something? And vaccines are very difficult. You think back to the very early 80s and HIV and AIDS. Now, I mean, we've just progressed dramatically with a cocktail. It's now moved into the lane of a chronic disease, but there still is not a vaccine for AIDS.
You still can be HIV positive, and people are, but they live a natural life.
Exactly.
They don't die of AIDS.
Yes.
That's
Well, it's important to dream and then pursue that with all of the bold steps that need to be taken. I have every confidence in this endeavor.
Well, that's terrific. So I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your leadership and your success with ARPA-H. And
hopefully.
Bless you.
George, thank you and the organization that you have shepherded and done so much and been a partner in this effort on ARPA-H, bringing forward so many scientists and stakeholders that we've worked with that have really been just absolutely essential in the effort. We wouldn't be where we are right now, poised for getting this over the finish line, were it not for your leadership and that of the organization. So I'm enormously grateful to you.
Very kind words, but that triggers another question. What benefit do advocates like Us Against Alzheimer's or Friends of Cancer Research or the Rare Disease Committee, what benefits, how do we help you?
You're the wind beneath our sails. You know, most people think that Congress is a proactive institution. I thought that when I first ran. I don't know what got into me, but Congress is a reactive institution. It reacts to the people of our country. If you don't hear from anyone on anything, then it doesn't exist. So advocates are really the wind beneath the sails of successful efforts in the Congress. Without that, it simply would not happen.
Well, we're going to help you make it happen since you actually have the authority. We will help you in any way possible to achieve your goals because everyone you've identified here today is absolutely vital to the American people.
Yes.
And I know how many priorities members of Congress have overall. And so the problem here is not the goodwill of members of the Congress, it's getting them to move in a direction that they all can have some consensus on.
And I think that it's important to give credit to President Biden because it was a year ago, it was 2021, when he summoned just a handful of members to meet with him, Senate, House, Republicans, Democrats. There were 7 or 8 of us that were there. And this was his vision, ARPA-H. So that very day, I came back up to the Hill and started working on it. So I really salute the president, and he understands what the great needs of the American people are. It's up to the Congress to make that a reality, and I look forward to getting it over the finish line.
Well, you know, it's striking, but you took leadership from President Biden, and President Biden has been very clear in talking about cancer and Alzheimer's as 2 killer diseases that ought to be addressed. But in the end, you brought along a lot of Republicans. So this is one thing the American people don't see a lot of, which is this bipartisanship, which is driven by individual members of Congress, yourself right now, I'll put at the top of that list, who can actually bring Republicans and Democrats together around a consensus. And the American people don't see that bipartisanship very much. The press seems to like the head knocking.
Oh, they do. They like covering controversy.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm going to stop again. Thank you for your time. I've
Thank
taken
you,
a lot of
George.
it.
Thank you.
And we appreciate your leadership, as I say, and your time today. Thank you.
You.